Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's daily devotional. So, our daily devotional today is going to come from an article that was published about 10 days ago or so. Some of you may have actually seen it pop up at one point or another. But this particular article is entitled, "Has Jesus' Childhood Home Been Discovered in Nazareth?" And I'm not going to read the whole article, but it is an interesting archaeological dig that they're doing. It says a UK archaeologist is shedding new light on a fascinating ancient site beneath a convent in Nazareth. In his new book, The Sisters of Nazareth Convent, Ken Dark, a professor at the University of Reading, examines the archaeological history of the area beneath the Nazareth convent, which is said to be the location of Jesus' childhood home. The research notes that a partly rock-cut early Roman period house was found at the historic site, as well as evidence of Roman-era quarrying and burial, a well-preserved cave church, and major surface-level Byzantine and Crusader churches. The location of the cave church and later churches are believed to be linked to the ancient house. In 2015, Dark identified the 1st century AD house within the crypt or cellar of the Byzantine church that was later built above it. The house and the remains of the Byzantine church are preserved within the Sisters of Nazareth convent. This is a picture of the 1st century house. It's kind of interesting. This is certainly a site which sheds a lot of light on what it was like in 1st century Nazareth, and there is no reason to discount the possibility that the people who built the Byzantine church there might have been correct in identifying the 1st century house as Jesus' childhood home. In his research, Dark explains that the first archaeological discoveries at the site were in the 1880s that led to excavations by the nuns in the 1930s. This site was investigated by Henri Senet, a Jesuit priest and former architect based in the Pontifical Biblical Institute of Jerusalem. Senet worked there from 1936 to 64, making detailed drawings of the structures discovered by the nuns, but did not publish any academic papers or research on the site. The site was then largely forgotten by experts. In 2006, Dark set up a new project to reinvestigate the site and examine the earlier research. The archaeologists found that the 1st century house on the site subsequently formed part of a quarry and then rock-cut tombs. After burial ceased at the site, perhaps in the 4th century, a cave church was constructed in the hill adjacent to the 1st century house. A large surface-built church was built probably in the 5th century above both the 1st century house and 4th century cave church. The large and elaborate church complex may have been the Cathedral of Byzantine Nazareth and survived through to the 5th and 7th centuries, possibly described as the Church of Nutrition in De Locis Sanctus, a 7th century work by Irish monk Adamnan. But anyway, so it goes on to describe a little bit more about the cave church and a little bit more about that sort of stuff. But it is interesting because there's been a lot of archaeology linked to places Jesus has been, or was thought to have been, his tomb, supposedly his tomb, and so forth. In fact, as the article ends, says last year in a separate project, the room venerated as the site of Jesus' Last Supper was revealed in stunning detail thanks to remarkable 3D laser scanning technology. Again, that was supposed to be. Okay, they don't know for sure that was it. Well, so this house, okay, in Nazareth, again, we have so little detail about Jesus when he was a child, and really the early life of Jesus up until he started his ministry. We have very little information about, or detailed information, I guess I should say, about what all he was involved in, what part of Nazareth they lived in. We know his father was a craftsman, a wood craftsman, carpenter, and so I mean there was a lot there's a lot of detail that we don't have. I thought it was interesting that they make the statement here that there's no reason to think See, where do they say that? I think it's at this bottom. Yeah. There's no reason to discount the possibility that the people who built the Byzantine church there might have been correct in identifying the first century house as Jesus' childhood home. The reason why, there's two main reasons to this, to looking at this article. First one is I never want to discount archaeological research and identify the fact that some archaeological research that they're doing has actually led to, if not confirmation of what the Bible has said. Not that the Bible needs it, but it always helps to have archaeological proof and evidence that things that are recorded in the Bible have been certified, and yes, this is what happened. But also to have that, I guess, support for our own faith in being able to look and see these sites that are mentioned in the New Testament, mentioned in the Old Testament. I know some have been on these tours of the Holy Land, and those of you who've been on these tours have said it's an amazing trip to be able to visit these places, and then to kind of put the references from the older New Testaments into context with actually what you see left of the ruins and of the archaeology and so forth. And of course, I'm fascinated by history, and I think that would be a fun thing to do at some point when I don't have 4 kids hanging around with me. But the other reason I wanted to bring, so that's one thing, is the fact that archaeology is always interesting to me. Anytime it has to do with the Bible, that sort of thing, it's interesting. But the second part of this is, notice the effort by man, even the effort by people associated with Christianity to build these shrines, build churches on sites that are regarded as holy because Jesus grew up in this house, or Jesus had his Last Supper in this room, or Jesus was buried in this tomb. Again, there's two different angles to this. Again, there's the archaeological support, obviously, that provides, if it's proven to be true, to the New Testament, and that's great. That's never a bad thing. It's always a good thing to have that. Yeah, this has been proven to be accurate. Again, the Bible doesn't need it. It doesn't need to be confirmed by history, secondary history, historical sources, or archaeology for it to be true. But to have that there it's affirming. But at the same time, you've got man who, because of these associations with Paul, Peter, and some of the other apostles, these associations with places, all of a sudden those become holy places. And nothing in the New Testament, for the example of the church that we're given, suggests any type of special attention being placed on where Jesus held the Last Supper, okay, with his apostles, where they took part in the Passover meal. There is no attention ever given to Jesus' childhood home in the New Testament. There's quite a bit of wisdom, I believe, here in the fact that God didn't record details about those things, because those things don't matter. It doesn't matter where Jesus grew up, whether or not this house is truly the house that Jesus grew up in. Again, the Byzantine church was built, what did they say? They estimated somewhere around the 4th century or so. Okay, that's a good 300 years after Jesus had died. Is it possible they got the right house? Yeah, but how many people lived in Nazareth? Okay, you got to figure there were probably several thousands of people who lived in Nazareth. What are the odds they got the right house, that this was Jesus' house? In the end, even if it is Jesus' house, there is nothing holy about it. It would be interesting, okay, and I would love to tour it if it were proven somehow to be Jesus' house. Sure, I'd love to go look at it. but it's a curiosity. It's archaeology, and it has nothing to do with the New Testament. It has nothing to do with God's word. It has nothing to do with salvation. And yet you have these churches, multiple churches actually being built. You've got the cave church, you've got the Byzantine church, multiple churches being built on top of this site or adjacent to this site because of just possible association with Jesus. Then you've got in Jerusalem, there are so many different sites that have been venerated and so forth as being associated with Jesus. Whether or not they actually were is irrelevant. The fact that it's thought that they were makes that place holy. And this is just one example. We've talked before about whether or not they're ever going to find the Ark of the Covenant, which I don't believe they will. But the Ark of the Covenant, Noah's Ark, that's actually something that's been in the news lately, whether or not they found a remains of a boat on top of some mountain that they think might be Mount Ararat. All of these, again, from a Christian perspective, from a perspective of one who's a Christian, that would be fascinating if they found the Ark of the Covenant. It would be fascinating if they found Noah's Ark, simply from, if only, not only from a historical perspective, but also from a historical archaeological connection to the Bible. That's great when those connections are found. But from a practical perspective, these things end up being worshipped. They end up being elevated beyond what their purpose should be. And it's as if there's some connection there to God or to God's power via the Ark of the Covenant, via Noah's Ark, via some place that may or may not be Jesus's childhood home. It's as if there's some close connection now we have to God through these places and through these artifacts that people claim to be associated in some form or fashion with either Jesus or the apostles. And it kind of reminds me a little bit of what Jesus says in Mark chapter 7. And starting in verse 5, we find that the Pharisees are upset. They said, why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat bread with unwashed hands? And Jesus answered them and said, well did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites. As it is written, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. And in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. For laying aside the commandment of God, you hold the tradition of men, the washing of pitchers and cups, and many other such things you do. He said to them, all too well you reject the commandment of God, that you may keep your tradition. And I think about the traditions that have been passed down, primarily associated with the Roman Catholic Church. But the associations of these places as being connections to Jesus and then venerated, though as if the ground upon which Jesus walked somehow it makes it holier than some other place. And again, I find it fascinating. I find the archaeology fascinating. But the ground itself, just because Jesus may have walked through that, maybe this isn't Jesus' house. Maybe it was a neighbor's house. And maybe Jesus, when he was a child, walked through that doorway. Does that mean that doorway is somehow holy? No, it doesn't. Much less the actual site of the Last Supper. If we knew for sure that this was the actual site of the Last Supper, would that somehow make that place holy? No, it wouldn't. It's not like Jesus rubbed magic or rubbed holiness on these places, and as if it just kind of stuck around. Okay, that's not how that works. Jesus, the places that he went to, Paul, Peter, these places, these were real places where real people lived, and the fact that they have been there, does that make it interesting in relation to the historical aspect of the Bible? Yes, it does. But even if we had actual vessels that Jesus touched, or pieces of clothing that Jesus wore. Would that make those things holy? No. And yet you know for a fact, because of how man reacts, those things would be worshipped as if they were some desperate attempt to make something physical in connection to God. And that is man's way. That is how man seems to have always been ever since he first started leaving the worship of God and turning to idols. It's been man's attempt to be able to touch God in some way and to use physical means by which to do it. And this is, again, the house is just another example of that. And when Jesus makes this statement about the hypocrites, he says, the people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. And yet how many times, and what Jesus says, obviously there's the hypocrisy of the Pharisees and the scribes is being described here because of the demand that the disciples wash their hands. But that's not actually a commandment of God. And so they place the commandments of man above the commandments of God, and Jesus even gives them an example of that in verse 10. But isn't it interesting that God never commanded these sites to be venerated? He never commanded the Holy Grail, if there is such a thing. He never commanded that be observed as some vessel of honor or vessel to be worshipped or vessel by which we worship. Okay, again, the very different variations of the Holy Grail. One would be the cup that Jesus drank out of at the Lord Last Supper. It doesn't matter. None of those things matter. What matters is doing what God says as He has said it, not substituting what God has said with what man wants to do, by which man somehow feels closer to God or feels somehow holier because we're in a place that Jesus may have grown up, or we're touching a wall that Jesus may have stood near, or we're touching cloth that maybe Jesus once wore, or whatever. None of that is important. Again, from an archaeological perspective, it's fascinating. From a connection to the New Testament, sure, you could, you look at that and say, oh yeah, that's that yeah, we read about that, this place, that place, whatever. But from a scriptural means of worshiping God, they don't matter. And yet, for a fact that if this place, this house that they found, if somehow, which they won't, but if they were to be able to somehow prove that this indeed was Jesus' childhood home, that there would be flocks of people worshiping and bowing and praying and shrines being set up. I mean, already 2 churches were built back in the 300s and 400s or 500s AD. That if there's any type of suggestion whatsoever that there is some sort of connection of Jesus with this house, it's the same thing's going to happen today. And while I understand it, it doesn't make it any less silly. Okay, it doesn't make it any less silly and sad that people feel like they have to have this type of physical connection as if to make them feel holy or right with God. And that's not. That's the beauty and the wisdom of God in what He has given us in the New Testament, is that we don't have to have these types of connections. Our faith isn't based on artifacts that could be lost or that can be destroyed. Our faith isn't based on places that we may or may not ever be able to go to, depending on our financial situations or political situations. Our faith is not based on those things. Our faith is based on the Word of God and on the events of the eyewitnesses that they recorded for us about Jesus dying, being raised the 3rd day, ascending into heaven, and we have that opportunity to be saved without any connection whatsoever to any physical artifacts, to any physical places. All right. As today, the devotional for you today. Again, it's interesting, it's fascinating, and I'm drawn. In fact, my Google has already figured out that apparently I love archaeology, so I'm constantly bombarded with all these archaeological links when they find stuff. It sends me the links and so forth all the time, and that's great. I like it. But I see this and I say, oh, well, that's interesting. But then, and you read through the article and you go, it's interesting. It in no way changes anything I believe or anything that I read in the New Testament. It's interesting, but there's going to be tons of people making pilgrimages there. There are. So anyway, keep in mind tomorrow we'll have our daily devotional again at 6:30. And then Sunday for our Wichita Falls brethren, we will not have class at 9. We will have worship at 10 only. So keep that in mind. All right, everybody, y'all have a good rest of the night. Lord willing, I'll see y'all tomorrow.